Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be little blue book number 1748, and it is titled Scientific Crime Detection by C. Samuel Campbell. And this is copyright somewhere in the 1920s, so it's not modern day crime detection. It's 1920s. And this is part 2. We left off with a new chapter coming up here. And we have our new chapter, Moulage. Moulage is the science of making casts of objects. Originally, this was done with plaster compositions, but plaster had its disadvantages. The new method, known as moulage, and developed by Dr. Alphonse Poehler of Austria, has proved itself such a decidedly superior technique that it has been widely adopted in criminological circles. 3 compositions are used in this process. The first composition, negocool, 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 is heated until it becomes gelatinous, and it is then painted on the object to be copied. After this negative cast has cooled, it can be removed from the object with ease, for it is somewhat elastic. Hominid, the second composition, is then heated until liquefied. A layer is painted or sprayed on the negrocool cast. Reinforcement of cheesecloth is added, and then another layer of hominid. Celurit, the third composition, is then melted and painted over the hominid. When the positive has cooled, it is removed from the negrocool negative. It is a perfect reproduction of the original object, losing not even the most delicate detail. It may then be painted in the colors of the original, a fine coat being used to preserve the details. The finished product is so real in appearance that, placed beside the original, it can very easily be mistaken. Chiefly, its value lies in its ability to reproduce and preserve the most minute detail, indispensable in its use in the making of reproductions of perishable evidence, such as footprints, tire prints, tool marks in doors and windows, which could not very well be carried into court for identification purposes. Teeth marks in apples, the preservation for future identification of the features of unidentified dead persons, preserving accurate rectified dead persons. Wait, no, that didn't make sense at all, did it? No. Preserving accurate record of the location of wounds on corpses to sustain the reports of medical experts. As one can readily see, its uses in crime detection are practically innumerable and far too obvious for further illustration. But that last sentence was a bit of a tough one to get through, wasn't it there? Okay, new topic, thank God. Handwriting. In long anonymous letters, a man, though trying to disguise his handwriting, gradually reverts back to his natural script. As he, or more than likely she, for at least 80% of such letters are written by women, writes the letter. His mind is occupied less and less with the disguising of the letter, and more with the letter content. As a result, his hand muscles shift slowly and unconsciously toward their accustomed position. It is possible for the handwriting expert to read from a specimen the nationality, age, sex, occupation, education, or special training of the author. If he has a specimen of the handwriting of a suspected person, he can also determine whether or not the suspect wrote the specimen in question. Just as France has its decorative and extravagant peculiarities in the handwriting, Germany its particular angularity, so all the nations of the world have their national characteristics by which their handwritings can, turning of the page, We almost had it there. Can be identified by an expert. Although America has a mixture of systems, they are all named and dated through their periods of change. These racial characteristics in a nation's handwriting are even more tenacious than the accent in speech. In fact, it is practically impossible to rid oneself entirely of them. There are environmental modifications as well. The distinctiveness of the librarian's script, the peculiarities of lettering in the writing of engineers and architects, the abbreviations and signs used by different professions, the unique word spacing of the telegrapher, and occasionally shorthand signs all aid the handwriting expert. They all creep in here and there despite the most rigid attempts to disguise the writing. Individual characteristics are additional means of identification. Considering letters only, there are 52 characteristics, all of which are made from two forms of 8 strokes. These strokes may vary in slant, length, height, closeness to preceding and following strokes, in the manner of beginning, ending, and joining letters, in spacing, direction, thickness, and shading. Added to these are peculiarities of spelling, word order, expression, punctuation. Line quality is difficult, for if all the different individual twists and peculiarities are to be accomplished, a signature must be drawn rather than written. This means gatherings of ink where the pen has slowed down at harder points, awkward lines resulting from attempted duplication of the delicate changes and weight of strokes, abrupt and stubby beginning and ending lines where there should be a tapering of pen strokes. All of these and other faults are bound to be made under the strain of the realization that one mistake will ruin the forger's entire work. New chapter. Typewriting. It has truly been said that when a criminal has written a forged or anonymous letter on a typewriter and does not care to have that letter traced to it, he had better break up the machine completely and then dispose of every bit of it in some sure and secret way. Every make of typewriter can be distinguished by its typewriting. As manufacturers select and design their own types of distinct individuality, their distinct individuality is lent to work typed on the different makes of machines. This difference may be in the serifs, or in the height or thickness of the letters, in their roundness or angularity. But whatever the difference is, it exists. Occasionally, manufacturers have improvements in their machines, as such times changes in type appear on the new models. It may be in only certain letters, but the change is there. It is this which helps an investigator to date a certain typewritten document. For the paper may bear a date several years before the model in which it was typed made its appearance. It also helps the investigator to narrow down his search for the individual machine which has been used. Turning of the page. As it enables him to look for a particular model of a certain make. Once he has located the machine, it is comparatively easy for him to identify it as the one on which the questioned typewriting was done. There are 84 characters on the standard typewriter, and any of these may be out of horizontal alignment. Any of them may tilt to the left or right. Various ones may print heavily on either side, top or bottom, or either of the 4 corners. Usage and the striking of one letter against a neighboring piece of type result in worn, broken, and scarred lines. All of these go toward making up the individuality of your typewriter, for there is practically no end to the defects that may appear in each typeface. An expert once testified in court that the chance of 2 machines before being alike in all defects was about 1 in 3 trillion. An expert can generally tell from a given specimen something of the emotional makeup of the typist at the time it was typed, due to the fact that emotional disturbances call forth physical responses, which in turn are bound to register themselves in the letters being struck. It just dawned on me while I was reading that typewriters isn't prevalent anymore. No one uses a typewriter anymore, as far as I know. It's all computer printed. Okay, back to it. New chapter. The Lie Detector. Popularly, boy that word, popularly, see how that goes, popularly known as the lie detector, the Keeler polygraph, perfected by Leonard Keeler of the Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory of Northwestern University at Chicago, is based on the principle that physical reactions accompany emotional disturbances. The working of the machine is dependent upon the pulse and respiratory changes, which always occur as a result of deception. An arm cuff, very much like that used by a doctor in taking your blood pressure, is fastened to the upper arm or leg of the subject, and a tube detecting respiratory changes is fastened about the chest or abdomen, the position being determined by the type of breathing of the subject. These are connected with indicators on the machine behind the subject. These indicators rest on a paper which revolves slowly on a drum, and record in irregular lines any change in either the pulse or breathing. When a lie is told by the subject, his heart increases, its beat, and his breathing becomes deeper. While these changes may not be visible to the eye, they immediately register themselves through the indicators in an increased irregularity in the lines on the polygram. After the machine has been fastened to a subject and a normal has been recorded, the subject is asked several questions which are irrelevant to the crime for which he is being tested. After his reaction to the answering of questions has been recorded by the indicators, he is asked questions directly pertaining to the crime. A monotonous tone of voice is preserved throughout the interrogation, and occasionally irrelevant questions are interposed to give the subject a chance to return to normal. Turning of the page. Oh, that's not right. There it is. At the end of the questioning, the record is examined. If it is indicative of guilt, the subject is questioned again, shown his initial record, and asked to account for the abnormal responses which he naturally dares not do truthfully. He realizes that the machine has detected his lies. His attempts to explain lead only to confusion. He becomes apprehensive of what this second test will show. His fear of this little machine that brands his every lie, and his increased efforts to control his emotional responses result only in a second polygram, even more irregular than the first. This self-induced torture with which the guilty subject puts himself through finally leads, in about 3/4 of the cases, to a confession. This ingenious little machine, of course, has its limitations. For one thing, a subject cannot be forced to submit to a test with any degree of success. Then, with evidence of lying once ascertained by test, it is practically impossible to get the evidence in court in a tangible enough form to be believed by a jury. The court is slow to recognize and put faith in advanced methods, but the lie detector does play a vital role in the police in determining between the guilt and innocence of suspects, and in aiding them in their consequent gathering of further evidence with which to secure a conviction in courts. Truth serums. It may sound like pseudo-scientific fiction to have your police officer give a suspect a drug. Reader's note, yes it does. With the result that your suspect truthfully answer every question put to him, even though those answers will send him to the electric chair. Yet this is no figment of some author's overactive imagination. Due to the prisoner's constitutional rights, though, such evidence, given unwillingly against oneself, is not admitted into court. Dr. Robert E. House of Texas made his valuable discovery concerning scopolamine, scopolamine, scopolamine. That's what we're going with. While operating on a woman under the influence of twilight sleep, a condition affected by this drug. When he asked the nurse a question, his unconscious patient answered. Since then, scopolamine has been experimented with until today. It is used in crime detection. It seems that under its influence, the brain areas used in conscious deception are in a condition wherein it is difficult for communication across the nerve terminals to take place. On the other hand, the paths leading to the memory areas seem to be left wide open, with the result that a question arousing any of those memories stored there is answered truthfully. One remarkable quality of scopolamine is that it opens up memory paths which have been closed as far as conscious memory is concerned. I'm going to have to Google that. New chapter. Ballistics. Ballistics, or the identification of firearms, is based on the same principle as is the identification of fingerprints, typewriting, handwriting, and other forms of criminal investigation. That principle is that no two things are turning the page. No two things are identically alike. Nor can any two things be manufactured by the same machine and be identically alike. The difference may be only microscopic, but there are, nevertheless, differences. First, let us consider the shell, which may be found at the scene of a crime. The firing pin, striking the primer in the head of the shell in order to explode the cartridge, has left its individual mark. For no two firing pins can be manufactured exactly alike. When a suspected gun is obtained, a test cartridge is fired in it. If this weapon is the one which left the shell at the scene of the crime, the markings of the firing pin on the test shell will duplicate the markings on the other, thus establishing the identity of the weapon. Added to this, the pressure of the exploding powder drives the shell back against the breech of the weapon, as the markings of the breech, which are usually a series of somewhat parallel lines made by the last machine operation on it, cannot possibly be identical in two different guns. This adds weight in establishing the identity of the gun. If the firearm was an automatic or repeating gun, then the ejector or extractor also leaves its individual markings on the shell as it hooks over the rim and withdraws it, throwing it to one side. In the case of a revolver, however, the shell is not ejected, but it is carried away in ordinary cases from the scene of the crime. Still, the police have the projectile of the fired cartridge by which to establish the individual identity of the weapon. The marks which are found on a bullet are due to the rifling of the gun barrel. This rifling is the cutting of the grooves and spirals down the entire length of the barrel, thus giving the bullet which passes through it a spinning motion and adding to its velocity and accuracy. As arms manufacturers have their own views as to what type of rifling is best, the make, model, and caliber of the firearm can be determined by the number, width, and depth of these grooves, and by the direction and angle in which they spiral, all of which can be read from the projectile which is fired from any of them. But weapons manufactured by the same machine in the same factory also differ, for the cutting edge of the rifling tool is subject to constant wear. This constant wear registers itself on the grooves it cuts to such an extent that no two grooves in even the same barrel will be identical. The bullet fired in a gun is the same diameter as the barrel. This means that as it passes through the rifled barrel, the elevated parts of the barrel, known as lands, cut out grooves in the bullet. The grooves, cut out the barrel by the rifling tool, leave lands on the bullet. The minute imperfections of both the lands and grooves in the bore of the gun and also engraved on it. The entire circumference of the fired bullet then bears large and fine markings which correspond in every turning of the page. Correspond in every detail with these markings in the bore of the firearm. When a bullet is found at the scene of the crime, the grooves and lands on it are examined to determine the make, model, and caliber of the weapon from which it was fired. When a suspected gun is picked up, a test bullet is fired into cotton waste. It is then placed under one tube of what is called a comparison microscope. The fatal bullet is placed under the other tube. These two bullets then build up a composite image in the single eyepiece of the instrument, a half of each bullet making up this image. One of the bullets is revolved until the grooves and minute scratches on it fuse with those on the other. If both have been fired from the same gun, this fusing is possible. Then both bullets are revolved together, and if the entire circumference of both duplicate each other, and all markings absolute identity of the suspected weapon as the fatal gun is established. Nor does the study of bullets and guns stop with the mere identification of one with the other. Bullets, if they have not struck some hard object after passing through the clothing of a person, will bear microscopic markings of the cloth. The study of these markings will often reveal the kind of garments worn by a murder victim, even though the body is naked when discovered. Criminals often file off the serial numbers of their guns to prevent the tracing of them, but the Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory of Northwestern University, Chicago, the largest institution of its kind in America, succeeded in restoring with an etching fluid the number of such a gun in the case of the murder of Alfred Jake Lingle, Chicago Tribune reporter, who was killed on June 9th of 1930. In doing so, they made it possible for both the dealer and the purchaser to be identified. Okay, just found something there. So it referred to the case of Alfred Jake Lingle, who was killed on June 9th of 1930. So this had to be written after 1930. So my estimation of it being somewhere in the 1920s is wrong. It's somewhere in the 1930s. Somewhere after June 9th, 1930. So there we go. Side note. Alright. In doing so, they made it possible for both the dealer and the purchaser to be identified. New chapter. Powder marks. Not only the shells and bullets, but the powder fired in cartridges also has its story to tell to the scientific criminal investigator. When a gun or shell which has been recently fired is found at the scene of the crime, it is possible, due to the difference in composition of black powder and smokeless powder, to tell which kind of powder was used simply by a sniff of the gun barrel or the shell, as the two powders leave a characteristically different residue. It is possible to examine the shell and thus determine the kind of powder which was used. An examination of the rear of the bullet will also give the investigator this information. With the explosion of black powder, many of the hard grains remain unburned or only partially burned. These unburned grains, which amount to secondary projectiles in themselves, strike the rear of the bullet as it travels down the barrel and pit it. The charcoal which goes into the making of this kind of powder also blackens it. Identification is possible in such cases for neither of these. Turning the page. For neither of these two conditions exists in the case of smokeless powder. The condition of the residue left by black powder in the bore of a firearm will give the expert a rough idea as to the time which has elapsed since the weapon has been fired. Scientific investigators have an ingenious little instrument for studying the rust, powder residue, scars, and blemishes in the barrel of a gun. It is a long, thin telescope affair with a lighting element at the end which goes into the barrel of an eyepiece and an eyepiece at the other end. As the periscope of this instrument, which is known as the helixometer, can be revolved slowly, it is possible to study every square millimeter of the barrel. In the manufacture of smokeless powder, different manufacturers produce different varieties. In some cases, the grains are square and thin. In other brands, they may be thin, circular discs or disc-shaped with a hole in the center. Then there are variations in color and other characteristics, all of which can be identified under the microscope. Often in the clothing of a murder victim, some of these unburned grains can be found and identified with samples on the shelves of the crime detection laboratory. Or they may be compared with the powder grains in the other shells of a suspect's gun, thus forging an additional link in the chain of evidence against him. In a handgun, due to the shortness of the barrel, much of the powder charge follows in the bullet out of the muzzle in an unburned state. Sharp, hard, and irregular, these grains of black powder resemble little bullets. If the weapon is fired close enough for them to strike the object aimed at before they have entirely dispersed or lost their force, they will make an irregularly circular powder burn, as the density and size of these powder marks vary with the distance of the gun from the object. Investigators, knowing the make, caliber, length of barrel, and kind of cartridges used, may make tests and comparisons to determine this distance. With smokeless powder, the zones of powder burning are liable to be less than in the case of black powder. For being much more powerful, a small amount is often used in shells. A well-stocked crime detection laboratory will have, for identification purposes, specimen cards illustrating many types of powder marks, from many types of guns and cartridges fired in varying distances. Identification of this sort alone may decide whether a man's death is a result of an accident, a suicide, or a murder. And I think we'll stop there for part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1748, Scientific Crime Detection, written by C. Samuel Campbell, somewhere after 1930. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in part 3.